Delighted to be starting off the next session, which is on the Arab Spring. And we're shifting format now to a featured speaker and a respondent. So I'd like to welcome Mojtaba Mahdavi to give the guest lecture. He is the ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies and a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. His recent books include Towards the Dignity of Difference, Neither End of History Nor Clash of Civilizations in 2012, and Under the Shadow of Khomeiniism, Problems and Prospects for Democracy in Post-Revolutionary Iran, forthcoming. He was also the guest editor of a special issue of Sociology of Islam on contemporary social movements in the Middle East and beyond in 2014. So Mojtaba is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute response from Hamid. And so I look forward to your presentation and then to our discussion as a group. And I assume that we'll have an equally rich exchange to the one that we had this morning.
I was tasked to talk about the Arab Spring in general, a broader picture of the Arab Spring. So I'll try to be not too long, so we could have actually more conversation and discussion. First, let's say a few introductory remarks. For quite some time, actually, Middle East exceptionalism, quote unquote, was a dominant discourse of Middle East studies. Long time ago, of course, a new Orientalist and new Orientalist discourse, from Ernest Gellner to, of course, Ernest Renan, to Ernest Gellner, to Lewis, to Huntington. These people actually talks about the whole concept or idea of Middle East exceptionalism, in the sense that Middle East is exceptionally immune to the process of secularization and modernization and democratization because of its cultural problem. So it's a culturalist discourse, cultural determinism. Then the whole idea of, particularism, cultural determinism, I'm not going to talk about all of this, West versus the rest. The Middle East is the land of ugly movements. Nothing really good come out of the Middle East and North Africa as a region because of its cultural problem, violent, anti-democratic culture. And basically, it's about Islam. That's the whole reductionist discourse of religious center, Islamic center, deterministic concept of Middle East exceptionalism. With the rise of new social movement, and then 2013 Gezi Park movement in Turkey, we see that this idea, concept of Middle East exceptionalism was challenged. That let's wait and see, maybe something really good could come out of the Middle East and North Africa. For these Orientalists, new Orientalists, I would say pessimistically watched and waited for the outcome, at least for a short period of time. But on the other hand, another very, very problematic discourse of modernist universalists run and represented by Francis Fukuyama and Folks. The idea of the end of history and the rise of the last man, unilinear trajectory of modernization, secularization, gained momentum, they thought. They thought that with the rise of these new social movements, we're going to actually see that new liberal democracy is going to gain a momentum, and we're going to see, as you mentioned, the fourth wave of democratization, a typical of new liberal democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, and they become like us. One size fits all sorts of modernization theory, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. So it's a modernist, unilinear, universalist trajectory of liberal, secular modernization and westernization. The way they basically described this movement was in the line of color revolutions of post-Soviet Union, Facebook revolutions. All of a sudden, Western technology actually empowered these people. There was no history, no background, nothing before the Arab Spring or 2009, 2010, 11 social movement, and all of a sudden it's the Western empowerment which actually created this momentum for this unilinear trajectory of progress. So it's a neoliberal democracy and the end of history and the rise and triumph of a new liberal agenda. That was, for sometimes, I guess, the dominant discourse of some media and even some mainstream academia. Soon, however, with the predicament of Islamism in power and the subsequent return of military junta into power in Egypt, the collapse of the Libyan polity with the NATO intervention and so-called sectarianism and civil war, then proxy and civil war in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and more specifically, the rise of ISIL, Daesh in Iraq and Syria, basically the suppression of Iran's Green Movement, the suppression of Gezi Park, basically this new Orientalist discourse gained another momentum. And in simple words, they told us that we told you that. We told you that nothing really is going to happen in this region. And this region is stuck with cultural determinism. The past is so present here that nothing authentic change could come out of, I guess, from this culture. Nothing. Change from within is quite impossible, period. If you are expecting a change, there should be a massive cultural and political shift. And of course, the whole idea of the clash of civilization, the West versus the rest, and all of the things which you are quite familiar with that. So apparently, ISIS now became, I guess, a good manifestation of MENA culture and politics. ISIS actually, and sectarianism, quote unquote, actually replaced the revolutionary pro-justice images of the MENA. And that still is there. You can see actually these days, when we talk about MENA, basically they talk about ISIS, not the Arab Revolution or the social movement. So that's what we see in much of the, I guess, debates and discussions. So it's quite amazing to me how such a simplistic, ahistorical, deterministic view dominates mainstream media and even some segments of academia. So this brings me to the second part of my brief talk. And I want to talk about, to suggest that we really need to understand what exactly happened to this movement and why counter-revolutionary forces actually prevailed. Is it culture or not, or is it a combination of so many factors and actors? Let's talk about this to problematize what exactly happened to this movement. But before that, I would like to suggest that there are actually different versions and views about what exactly happened. And now I would like to suggest that maybe first and foremost, we need to talk about some differences and similarities among these movements. Because these movements were not actually unique. There were similarities, but at the same time, they had quite different characters and natures. Basically, if I want to start from 2009, Iran's Green Movement, let's talk about some differences. Unlike the rest of the social movement, new social movement in the Middle East and North Africa, Iran's 2009 Green Movement actually happened under an Islamist government and not pro-Western government, apparently. So Iran is probably a unique case in the Middle East, which for more than 37, 38 years, people actually experienced living under an Islamist government. And with different versions and elements of Islamism, of course, I can talk about it. Then the Green Movement, of course, came out of the process of rigged election. I'm sure you are familiar with that. I don't want to repeat those things to you. It was mainly, but not exclusively, a middle-class movement. And also, it happened actually only a few major big cities, not nationwide. I don't want to deny that there was demand, there were demands for change, but the actual reality was in major cities. And of course, the symbolic leaders of the movement were quite reformist, and they came from within the establishment. Of course, the whole movement transformed and changed these leaders actually, and they became more and more representative of the movement during the Green Movement. But initially, these people actually came from the establishment. The Gezi Park, quite contrary, actually happened under a post-Islamist government of Justice and Development Party with a different context. And as we discussed, the Gezi Park to me represented a more authentic version of post-Islamist discourse, post-ideological discourse, anti-liberal discourse, definitely, and the combination of leftists, I guess, Muslims, seculars, of course, women, gay, lesbian, and all of them. Definitely anti-liberal, anti-neoliberal discourse. The Arab Spring, even each case, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya were quite different. But perhaps one similar things about all of these cases, almost all of them actually lived actually under a security state. So these estates were security state, pro-Western in most cases, and of course they experienced a neoliberal political agenda, privatizations, and all of these things. So these are some perhaps differences among and within these different movements in the MENA. When it comes to similarities, perhaps we can say almost all of these movements, Iran's Green Movement, Gezi Park, and the Arab uprisings were, as I briefly mentioned, were cross-culture, cross-gender in many ways, more or less, cross-religious generation. So it basically was a coalition of so many diverse forces. And that's why it's been actually characterized by Asif Bayat, Hamid, and others as post-ideological. And I'm talking about that momentum. Things got wrong in different directions after that, but I'm just basically talking about that social political momentum which was created on that age. So in a way, actually, it was quite basically challenging the discourse of orthodox and canonical Marxism that class analysis can explain everything. There were so many factors and actors, including religion, culture, gender, environmental concerns, so many actually factors and actors actually work together, which conventional Marxism actually could not predict it. And religion, of course, was one among many other factors. And also it was quite unlike what some Islamists, especially some authorities in Iran, in post-revolutionary Iran, described the Arab uprising as Islamic awakening, which was another actually reductionist discourse that these movements were not particularly religious, and it was not basically an attempt to revive Islam in public sphere. It was actually post-Islamist. I'll briefly explain it. Another major things which was quite perhaps similar in almost all cases was that to use Asif Bayat's concept of middle class poor, a new class. This middle class poor actually represented as the main driving force of almost all these social movements. And the middle class poor, to be concise and clear, is that these people actually are culturally middle class in a way. They are actually exposed to global issues, but economically are quite poor. And this actually created a tension for actually demanding more, I guess, social justice issues. And Bouazizi of Tunisia actually represent a classic example of this middle class poor as a new class. And you can actually see this middle class poor as a new class even in Occupy movement in the West. So this was not actually quite unique in the case of, I guess, Middle East and North African social movement. Of course, you can find other classes, but perhaps mainly that was the representative of the class figures. Also, neoliberal policies, Washington consensus, environmental crisis, shortage of water, misuses of natural resources. All of these things actually contributed to this crisis. So there were, of course, diverse factors. On an intellectual basis, what we saw in this movement was a huge paradigm shift from Islamism or nationalism towards post-Islamism and post-nationalism, to use Asif's and Hamid's arguments and others. So almost all these movements were post-nationalist, post-pan-Arabism, or pan-Turkism, or pan-Iranianism. There was no major figure of nationalist figure or even religious figure. And they were also actually post-Islamists, but not post-Islam, definitely. Post-Islamist in the sense that if Islamism stands for the idea of Islamic state and divine state, post-Islamists actually suggest that Islamic state is an oxymoron. Islamic state, it's quite impossible. You can appreciate public religion in a civil society or political party, but as a state, this is quite impossible. A state is a secular entity, if you want to use that phrase or concept, no matter who rules it. That was the whole idea. So post-Islamists appreciate public religion in civil society, even political parties, unlike the liberal argument of privatization of religion, pushing religion in private sphere, which is not actually doable. However, unlike Islamists, they suggest that a state is a secular entity, is a worldly affair, and you cannot possibly Islamize it. So a state is not divine, and of course, statements should be responsible and accountable to what they really do. So post-Islamism, it's a paradigm shift in all these movements. The proof is that if you actually listen to the slogans of people, millions of people came to the streets of Middle East and North Africa. There was no single slogan in support of Islamic State. None. There was nothing in support of Islamic State or Islamic Caliphate. And this is quite amazing. We quickly forget what exactly happened a few years ago, and all of a sudden ISIS becomes the dominant discourse. Main slogans were social justice, adalat al-ijtima'iyya, hurriya, freedom, and karamat al-insaniyya, human dignity. And you tell me these are religious or secular? None. So basically, the social condition was quite revolutionary in the sense that they actually challenged this false dichotomy of religious, secular, faith and freedom, to use Hamid and Asif Bayat's argument, local and global. It was quite actually remarkably new and, of course, representative of actual daily life of people, how actually people actually live in that part of the world. So no single slogans for the revival of Islamic State. They challenged Islamism because Islamism as a discourse and movement was exhausted. And I don't really have time to elaborate on this. Islamism is a child of modernity, actually. And at the same time, it's a response and reaction to modernity. Islamism does not represent tradition, it basically reinvents tradition. And one of the most important manifestations of reinventing tradition is the invention of the idea of Islamic State, which Islamic State itself is a post-colonial invention. There is absolutely nothing in the tradition which represents the idea of Islamic State. Islamic State itself, like Islamism, is a modern invention, in a post-colonial invention in response and reaction to the crisis of colonial modernity. So if you want to understand Islamism or Islamic State by simply reading religious texts, well, be my guest, but I guess you don't get much. What we really need to understand is the socio-economic political condition in post-colonial condition to understand why all of a sudden Islamism and of course Islamic State gained momentum. So that's the point of departure. Religion matters, culture matters, traditional matters, but all of them actually were being reinvented. And reinventing tradition by itself is a modern exercise. And that's how we basically can challenge this conventional Orientalist, New Orientalist a modernist discourse of the left and the right, quite honestly. You see actually this modernist discourse among the conventional liberal and of course some of the conventional Marxists. And that's the value of, I guess, discourse of decoloniality and post-coloniality, critical post-coloniality. So basically, these movements represent a third way, not Tony Blair's third way, no. I mean, a real third way which challenge culturalism on the one hand and hegemonic universalism on the other hand, and basically called for an authentic, homegrown, grassroots concept of modernity. I know Hamid is critical of the concept, alternative modernity, multiple modernities, or perhaps anything which comes new. I know. Maybe we can actually reclaim some of these concepts or come with a new concept. So that's definitely a paradigm shift to create a glocal, a dialectical relation between global and local here. So post-Islamism in this context actually was both a condition, a social condition, and also, as Asif Bayaz put it, an intellectual project. A social condition which represents post-ideological discourse, and of course an intellectual discourse of merging false, I guess, pioneers of faith and freedom, religion, and of course revelation and reason, global, local and global, and all of these things. So the momentum was there. That's the point. And the optimism, my point is that this optimism for the creation of an authentic way was not unfounded. It was there. And if I want to actually give you some examples of this post-Islamist momentum, I can talk about perhaps one relatively successful case of Tunisia under Hizb al-Nahda, a Renaissance party with the leadership of Rashid al-Kanoushi, who specifically said, look, we do not want to create an Islamic state. We want Dawlat al-Madaniyah, civil state. Even some people among the Muslim Brotherhood, the younger generation, also actually use the concept of civil state. I do not want to romanticize post-Islamism. I do not want to suggest that these discourses are absolutely perfect. No, there are problems here, but my point is that the whole concept of divine state and Islamism as a of course, paradigm shift had another shift towards post-Islamist discourse. So you have Hizb al-Nahda, Renaissance Party, and in their latest actually Congress in May 2016, they specifically abandoned the concept of political Islam and said, we want to be actually Muslim Democrats, like Christian Democrats, definitely socially and culturally conservative, but politically more representative. That's the diversity of this post-Islamism. Justice and Development Party of Turkey, of course, with strong elements of authoritarianism under Erdogan. But still, it doesn't actually challenge the discourse of post-Islamism. Still, it's more about the personality of Erdogan. Or Justice and Development Party of Morocco, again, socially conservative, but politically, of course, more representative in a way. And I would say the younger generation of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, not the old guard, represent that sort of tradition. And more specifically in Egypt, it's the Hizb al-Wasat, the center party. Quite amazingly, actually, they are Muslims, but they do have actually more women and Christian Copts representative in their political party. They specifically reject the idea of the Sharia Islamic law, so-called. And of course, if you want to talk about a post-Islamist, post-nationalist momentum and movement in Egypt, we can talk about the rise of the new left in Egypt, April 6th movement, or the coalition of course, Kefaya movement in Egypt, and of course, many versions of post-Islamist groups and intellectuals in post-revolution in Iran, which I'll be happy to elaborate it if it's needed. So the point is, post-Islamism was there, both as a movement, social movement, and an intellectual discourse for quite some time. But now, in 2016, things have changed, of course. And the third part of my quick talk here is what exactly went wrong, why we are actually facing this problem. In short, I think there is a network of local, regional, and global factors. And in other words, we do have actually the assemblage of both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces. Both revolutionary forces actually learn from each other, and counter-revolutionary forces also actually learn from each other, the regimes and forces. So that's quite amazing, the assemblage of revolutionary pro-justice movement and the assemblage of counter-revolutionary forces. So, and each case is really, really different. We have to talk about each case more specifically. In Egypt, you have the rise of Ikhwan, and President Morsi, he came to power, and he became arrogant, quite honestly. He simply forget that he represents only some 30% of the Egyptian population. And all of a sudden, he thought that Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, represent the whole Egyptian nation. He simply forget that Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, actually joined the Egyptian Spring at the 11th hour. They were not the first, actually. On the other hand, and worse than Ikhwan, the secular liberals and, of course, leftists, quite naively, trusted army to get rid of the Islamists. This is 101, folks. Never, ever trust army. Army has its own agenda. And I think, in my view, this was actually more than simply a political mistake. It has some epistemological crisis in the thinking of liberal and Marxist, Orthodox Marxists, about the modernist trajectory of progress. You can actually do some surgical activity, fast food things perhaps, fast, I don't know, actions to get things fixed. That was definitely something wrong. In Libya, you have the liberal colonial intervention of regime change under the pre-context of R2P, our own Canadians, responsibility to protect and destroy a nation in one afternoon. And then you have, of course, all sorts of course, refugees in Europe these days, and you see these people are, I guess, of course, complaining. So if you can actually get refugees, don't intervene and don't actually attack other countries. In Syria, all of a sudden, some corrupt regional leaders, such as Saudi Arabia and others, actually were worried about democracy in Syria, or Turkish authorities actually helped some of the Islamists, or Western authorities actually wanted to get rid of Assad at any cost. And this was not quite new, actually. The same policy of supporting radical, extremist Islamists to get rid of progressive, I guess, forces. This is an old history of a story of US foreign policy during the Cold War, the classic cases, Afghanistan, and we all know exactly happening. And now you have, of course, the huge crisis in Syria. On the one hand, the West, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, you have, of course, Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah and others. And that's the issue of geopolitics and proxy war. Then, of course, Yemen and Bahrain. Bahrain was suppressed because of Saudi's intervention, and since in Bahrain you have the US Fifth Fleet, there was absolutely no objection to the suppression of Bahrain's spring. And the rise of ISIS, Daesh. If I want to be short, I would suggest that Daesh, ISIS, is a fourfold modern monster. And I underline modern. And there are 4 factors contributed to the rise of ISIS and Daesh. The first one is the American invasion of Iraq. I mean, instead of going back to 14 centuries ago and Prophet Muhammad to find a way why we have Daesh today, well, let's go back 14 years ago and see what exactly happened with the American invasion of Iraq and the post-invasion policy, which basically destroyed the whole nation. debathification, marginalization, Abu Ghraib using phosphorite bomb. People do not forget that. The second factor is the Syrian crisis, proxy war. I mean, what expect come out of Syria if you have this proxy war and, I guess, war crimes and, of course, routine, all sorts of, crimes against humanity. The third factor which empowered Daesh, ISIS, is the ideology of Wahhabism. Comes from Saudi Arabia, the closest ally of the United States. I mean, to use Fatemeh Mernissi, late Fatemeh Mernissi argument, Saudi Arabia represents palace fundamentalism. I mean, we have to talk about this stuff quite honestly. And the fourth factor, we can talk about the rise of ISIS, is the marginalizations of second and third generation youth in European countries. Just go and see outside of Paris, Shantytown, or Belgium or other countries. Well, you see this sort of marginalization, forced assimilation, colonial modernity actually create a momentum for this. So these are quite modern, phenomena. So, and then all of these things. To conclude, my first conclusion is that, yes, we do have assemblage of revolutionary forces, and unfortunately, we do have assemblage of counter-revolutionary forces. My second conclusion is that these revolutions are not over. And to use your concept of afterlife of this movement, I would say that there is an unfinished project of new social movement. And this is not simply wishful thinking. I do have reasons for that. And the main reason is that because of massive structural and demographic changes in the whole region. You cannot ignore these massive demographic and structural changes, and also cultural changes, and also the memory of revolutionary momentum. People still have those memory that they could do it and they could do it again. So that's also, the memory is almost there. Next, concluding remarks is that to use Gramsci's words and approach, I would suggest that we are experiencing organic crisis across the regions. But at the same time, I would like to use Gramsci's remarks, who reminds us that we do need to overcome the pessimism of the intellect with the optimism of will. And the will is there. Again, it's not something wishful thinking. The will requires us to use Walter Minolo and Hamid's words, declare our intellectual independence from the colonial epistemology of coloniality, of arrogance, of end of history, or epistemologic ignorance of cultural essentialism. Arrogance and ignorance, both. So we really need to delink and disobey. And this is not wishful thinking. It does exist in the discourse of decolonial scholars of the Global South, or MENA, Fanon, Shariati, and many others. But more importantly, on the streets of the MENA regions, Middle East, in the life of ordinary people, in the everyday life of people. And we intellectuals actually need to learn and get inspired from ordinary people. And the last point, when Janet actually asked me to think about the concept of assemblage, I thought maybe Edward Said's concept of traveling theory could be something we really need to talk about it. And Edward Said used the concept of traveling theory to suggest that people actually use different theories in different historical contexts, and occasionally they use it in a much better, more radical ways. And here we have Gillen and Hamid use, I guess, Fanon's idea. And I'm sure there are more people and more opportunity to use it. And maybe I can use Heidegger and, of course, Muhammad Arkun's concept of unthought. And I suggest that there is much unthought in the thought of our intellectual tradition, which needs to be rediscovered and reclaimed, to create more traveling theories, and perhaps with critical engagement to create, of course, assemblage of thinking across borders or without borders. And this is possible, and this assemblage of thinking, I think, could very much contribute to enrich the assemblage of critical, revolutionary, pro-social justice movement in the Middle East and beyond. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, Janet and colleagues, for asking me to comment on Mojtaba's very fine intervention. Let me begin by first sharing something about the very title of Arab Spring. In my work, beginning with the book on the Arab Spring, I said that I use the phrase Arab Spring under erasure. It's a good concept, but it also conceals concept. Why? Because of the fact that at the same time that the Arab revolutions were happening, events in Tunisia, in Egypt, to some extent in Morocco, Syria, etc., we have almost identical events happening in sub-Sahel Africa, from Senegal to Djibouti, that were completely under the radar. Didn't make it to the thing because they were not part of the category of Arab. And discussion of Arab Square and Arab this and Arab that concealed, extremely important. In Zimbabwe, a group of youth gathered to look at the videotape of Tahrir Square, and they were arrested and jailed. You had self-immolation happening in Djibouti, exactly at the same time. But they didn't make it to the category because the category. So that, for our purpose, for our gathering here, is a good indication that sometimes the very categorical concepts that we use are useful, but at the same time concealing. Another example, as I was listening to colleagues talking about the Gezi Park, almost at the same time that Gezi Park was happening, we had a protest in Syntagma Square in Athens. Now, we usually categorize Syntagma and Athens as anti-austerity measures and European Union and the Merkel this and that, as we should, it was. And we categorize Gezi Park as struggle for the preservation of public sphere and public space against privatization and so forth. But the dominance of these two imaginative geography of Europe and non-Europe is so powerful that something right in front of your eyes, you don't see connections and links and so forth. So it is important in the exercise of assemblage to begin to question the very categories we use and to what extent they are still valid. Now, Mojtaba, as always, he has an exquisite mind of categorizing, periodizing the kinds of knowledge that have been produced both before the Arab Spring and after Arab Spring, the three phases that he outlined, sort of Middle East exceptionalism and Facebook revolution, and the assumption that these machines that we carry, these iPhones, they were created somewhere in North America. I always say, take the algorithm out of that machine. What do you have? Yes, Steve Jobs was a Syrian immigrant, right? His parents. So the algorithm inside that, what does look up the word algorithm? Where does that come from? Al-Khwarazmi, try to good it. That kha is good for your throat. Where did that come from? So you cannot just cut to the moment that we have iPhones and forget where the history of iPhone comes from. The third phase that he discussed, namely the paramount of this kind of a Schadenfreude, happiness. Oh, did you see that they collapse? Ain't that cool? We didn't tell you that these Arabs are stupid. They are not capable of the revolution. Now, one thing that Mojtaba referred to Asif Bayat's work exquisite work on the notion of post-Islamism, and my work, is a little bit of a false familiarity. Asif is a dear friend of mine. I love him. But our ideas are very different. In fact, Asif Bayat's notion of post-Islamism is much closer to French thinkers like Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy, who Olivier Roy talked about the failure of political Islam. And Gilles Kepel discusses similar things. So what Asif does is really more in line with Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy. My proposal of this collapse, and as Mojtaba said, the ending of that clash between the West and the Islam, which was productive, was regenerative of ideas. These ideas, I categorize them into three categories: Islamism or militant Islamism, socialism, and nationalism. These three, for about 200 years, they were splitting the loyalties and activisms of revolutionary mobilization. And the formations of these three ideologies, by the way, they were mostly by Muslim intellectuals and activists themselves, not by Orientalists. Has nothing to do with Orientalism. That's a different project. And what happened in the course of particularly Islamism was the aggressive transmutation of Islam as a multifaceted cosmopolitan civilization into a singular site of ideological resistance to Western imperialism. This is what happened. For Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, Al-Afghani, etc., all of them, they're actively engaged because they come from an imperialist background. They are, the Islamic empire from the Abbasids all the way to the Seljuqids. So the notion of confrontation with a new empire shakes the doctrinal foundation of Muslim intellectuals, and they try to come up with an ideology towards it. Now, this exhaustion, this is the moment that I propose. This moment is the moment of exhaustion. This is what I said, that we need a hiatus, remissive space, as Philip Brief used to call it, in which to think, so where are we going? Because those kinds of ideologies, it doesn't mean that nationalism has disappeared. Apropos disappearance of nationalism and racism in Gezi, which you are right, but these are classical cases of false Gemeinschaft. False Gemeinschaft happens in all atmosphere, including in Gezi. So one should not read it as nationalism has disappeared or racism has disappeared. So that moment of exhaustion of epistemological foregrounding of these ideologies, of course, is what I called liberation geography, namely a moment that we are beginning, that where we are, that the emergence of new assemblages that could now produce, hopefully, ideally, this is the task of critical thinking, 3 minutes. Thank you. That's very generous of you. To cut to the chase, there are undercurrents that are happening. Most massively, demographic changes, the decline of infant mortality rate, the rise in life expectancy, environmental catastrophes, desertification, population movements, labor migration, universalization of women's rights movements, sort of the intercutting of the third wave of feminism with the rise of Islamic feminism or labor feminism, and so forth and so on. These are movements that kind of gloss over colonial and post-colonial frontier fictions that no longer are legitimate and operative. The pictures, this pictorial fixation of European television, BBC, etc., with the moving of the so quote-unquote Syrian migrants. They are not all Syrians. There are Iraqis, there are Afghans, there are Iranians, there are from Africa. They're all over, but the term for them became Syrian, is the nervousness of the idea of Europe that is beginning to be violated. As Mark said yesterday to me, since the time that Edward Said wrote Culture and Imperialism, he used to tell us they are European literary historians are nervous that an Arab has touched Jane Austen. And that's the kind of anxiety that we have had it since there, and now we have it in the wishy-washy reaction. Now, in response to these really anxiety-provoking, massive movements that are happening, that is beyond the control. You see, that Europe needs the labor, but doesn't like the laborer. The same is with United States. They need, who is going to do the menial jobs that they need? Collecting tomatoes and such. They need the labor, but they don't like the laborer. This, in turn, you have the opposite side of these massive movements, which is the rise of surveillance state, the militarization of police, and the, above all, with which I conclude, above all, the rise of the, what Harold Laswell called garrison state, the aggressive militarization of the state, that you have Barack Obama giving $38 billion to Israel for the next 10 years, way beyond his retirement. To do what? I mean, how many bombs do you need to kill Palestinians? This 38 billion, okay, 3.88 million in a country that has 55 million people under poverty line, and twice poverty line, 110 million is even more catastrophic. Nobody talks about twice poverty line, which means a husband and wife 18 hours backbreaking work in order to make ends meet. That's the country from which Barack Hussein Obama, Audacity of Hope, just gave $38 billion to Israel to kill more Palestinians. But it's not just, I mean, you don't need, how many bombs do you need to kill Palestinians or throw a stone at you? Is a larger indication of the militarization of the state apparatus, which dovetails with militarization of the police force, which dovetails with the digitization of citizenship. Not just atomization, digitization. When you cross the border, you have to correspond to your digital registers, not your freaking picture that correspond to you. No longer exist. That leads to augmented reality and nervousness that you see, that one undergraduate student at Berkeley wants to offer one course on Palestine. The whole Zionist apparatus is mobilized against one freaking course, with the utterance of the word settler colony. Compare that with 200 atom bombs that, according to Colin Powell, Israel is sitting on it. 200 atom bombs, 38 billion military aid. They're scared of one course of one undergraduate student on it. Put those numbers in front of you, and you see this aggressive militarization results in the formation of ISIS as the wet dream of all of these states, because it is the manifestation of everything that they have done and they continue to do. It is, if ISIS didn't exist for reasons that Mojtaba rightly elaborated, they would have willed it to exist in order to be a diversionary tactic. In my opinion, at the end of the day, these are all futile, because the demographic and environmental pressure that is emerging from the ground up will have its own mandate, will generate its own ideas, will produce its own emancipatory thinking, as in fact Janet's generous, wonderful gathering of this very conversation indicates. Thank you.